Welcome back. So today we're going to take a look at CCA CA16 Pro. So the Pro is actually the follow-on to the CCA CA16, which is this guy from last year. Popular model, came out prior to KZ ZAS, and the two had two slightly different signatures, and some people preferred the CA16, some preferred the ZAS. I actually like both of them. But so this year we have the CA16 Pro, which has a similar look. It's definitely more similar look to KZ ZAS. On the side it says 1DD7BA, so that tells you the driver configuration. CA16 Pro hybrid technology upgrade. So these are the standard CCA-like tips. They tend to be kind of a little wide and very shallow. And those work for some people they will not work for. Since they're in the box, you should at least try them, but I tend to not use them. I prefer something that's a little more extended than these kind of tips, but they're in the box, so please do try them. The cable is a SPC cable, and it's one of the newer styles from CCA or KZ where you get this flat-like cable. So if you look at it from the side, it's kind of thin, and you get the two cores side by side, and you get the 90-degree 3.5 millimeter connection, and QDC connectors, which is that rounded oval in the middle that shows you that's QDC. Box itself, I unboxed it, nothing too crazy. It's got the standard KZ or CCA-like metal faceplate that says CCA CA16 Pro and the driver configuration again. So I thought we'd do something a little different, maybe a little quicker this time. I mean, for the most part, the CA16 Pro is almost identical to the ZAS, and perhaps it is identical. I can't guarantee it, but it's very, very close. So I didn't necessarily want to spend yet another review on a ZAS twin. So we'll at least walk through the graph, and we'll kind of talk about what I like about both models and what I don't necessarily like about. So as I said, if you're a CA16 owner from last year, you'll sort of recognize this green line. And the CA16 had a slight sub-bass roll-off, and then it had these nice thick mids, and this very gentle rise in the gain, and then it actually slopes up a little bit through the treble, so relaxed a bit here and then bump it up here. So it's kind of an interesting sound. I didn't mind it. I would prefer if the green was down a little bit, but the way it is in the CA16 and the way the upper range was extended, I think it was actually a very successful set for those reasons. It wasn't your sub-bass head fans, but that's plenty of bass at that level, so no complaints on there. So when we look at the ZAS, which is the red, versus the CA16, which is in blue, they pretty much overlap 100% until about right here. And I'm not going to swear that those are actually different right there. I think they are. I mean, that's what it sounds like to my ears, just because at this particular spot, at 4.7K or so, it's one of those sensitive spots to me, and the CA16 Pro at higher volumes does kind of ping me right there. So I do think that's there. It's something I didn't notice on the ZAS, but I do think it's probably there. And the rest of it is pretty much identical. So typical with the ZAS, you get this, and we'll start with the bass level. So if you remember, the ZAS actually has, some people call it a bass cannon. Is the CA16 also a bass cannon? I mean, it basically has the same exact bass level as ZAS, and a lot of it's going to come down to your tips. So what I noticed is certain tips really emphasize the bass level of CA16 Pro, and some do not. So I've heard it both ways. I would swear that, with certain tips, it doesn't sound nearly as bassy as the ZAS does. And that was a set that I thought was pretty much a bass cannon and way too much bass. So I will say that Yes, they are 100% almost the same on the graph, but physically in my ear, I will say that, depending on what tips you choose, maybe they do sound slightly different, but I think with the tips that I ended up using, when they sound a little bassier, I think the CA16 Pro and ZAS, both, with a bass emphasis style tip, I think essentially do sound exactly the same, especially right there. And it's way up there in bass level, way above the Harman target. So you have to be a bass lover, and this level of bass going on for an hour-long session for me is going to get fatiguing. It's just a lot. It's a lot kind of pounding at your ear. So do take that into consideration. It's not a light bass set. It's not even a remotely slightly boosted bass set. It's got plenty of bass, and it doesn't necessarily fall off quickly either. So you're going to get, especially in your lower mids here, both the ZAS and the CA16 Pro, very much influence the lower mids, and especially those lower male voices. Think about Sam Smith's voice at the beginning of another one. When he hits really low, there should be some separation between his voice and the background notes. And in this one, with this kind of that much bleed into it, the two really do kind of mix together. You don't have as much separation in the bass as you should. So I would call the bass level still KZ fun. It's very much a high quantity versus quality. It's not tight, it's not fast. It's just kind of a fun, big, bassy set. And that carries through right into your lower mids, and you get that thicker lower mid sound. And then when you hit kind of this bottom peak, where CA16 had a kind of this gentle rise, and I think that was just, you get a little more, I think it sort of blends the two a little better. So as you're transitioning from these lower notes into the upper rates, I think the CA16 does it a little better, and the ZAX does it a little better, especially in the vocals, where you hear those lower bits of voices as even female voices trail off or male voices trail off, and they hit those lower notes. I think all that is much smoother on the CA16 original and even the ZAX. So what you get on ZAS and CA16 Pro is this quicker rise, and for me, it's a sharper sound to me, and it almost emphasizes details and sharpness, and there's a cooling of the sound as you get from the lower into the upper. It very much cools off and sharpens up, and I think for EDM, dance music, electronic music, I think that works really, really well, and you end up with almost a sharper V in this style with CA16 Pro and ZAS, whereas CA16 was kind of this gentler, darker, smoother sound. And when I look at especially where this peak is, it's a little early, it's a little sharp for my ears. When you look at where the Harman target is, kind of about right here, and where ZAX is, it's about right here also. And I think the way ZAX splits the difference between CA16 and ZAS and CA16 Pro, I think that's the one that works for my ears. So 16 was probably a little late. CA16 Pro is a little early. ZAX is kind of right in the middle. And it's the nice balance between having enough, lower treble energy, but not too much where it starts to get a little fatiguing. And I think right where this one is on certain voices and certain instruments, it does hit you as a sharper sound, and it's going to be a little bit more fatiguing than something like the CA16. So do take that into consideration. So once we're over the peak and you get this kind of sharp peak, and then it really falls off into this non-fatiguing range, and that's exactly what the ZAS and the CA16 Pro kind of sound like. You get over the hump, and then it drops off quite quickly. So instruments that are right here at 2K sound very energetic, very forward. And then everything beyond that, the energy trails off pretty quickly. So if you're listening to strings and they sound quite energetic here, and then as they hit higher notes, it starts to trail off, and it's noticeable. And I noticed it on deadmau5's Strobe, the OV version, and because the strings start out lower and then keep on rising and rising, and they should be soaring and rising, they don't necessarily do that. They sort of hit this plateau and then kind of trail off, and still present. I wouldn't call this a fell off the cliff level at all. It's just a non-fatiguing, lower energy level than what I've had in the past on KZ sets. So, but I think this is going to be attractive to some other people who are very sensitive to these bits. And like I said, if you're sensitive to 4K, I would keep the volume a little lower. I noticed it definitely when I raised the volume to a certain point, but at lower volumes it's much less noticeable. The problem with the lower volumes is this lower treble level is also lower at lower volumes, so you end up essentially with a darker style set. So for me, it was very much a balance with CA16 Pro, was raising the volume to have, you know, the upper section match the lower section, but not have the 4.7K piercing my ears. So there is a nice midpoint, and it's not that hard to find, but do think about where the right volume is for if you're a very high volume listener. I think ZAS at least worked for me, and certainly different tips are probably going to work better for you on CA16 Pro, so do take that into consideration. So beyond the treble, and I think another thing that worked really well on CA16, the original, was the stage. So CA16 was one of the first kind of budget sets that had real height to it. And it was pretty odd where they added the extra driver. It actually did make quite a bit of difference for me. And I thought CA16 had quite a unique stage compared to other sets at the time. And then I think that followed on with ZAX as well. I think they both did quite well as a next generation upgrade from ZAX, ZSX, and C whatever it was, the previous CCA one. So, and I think part of that was the extension that CA16 had. And I think on ZAS, you actually do lose a little bit of that. And I noticed that there isn't really that much height on ZAS or CA16 Pro. There's a nice depth to it, and it's actually wide enough. But as far as the height that CA16 has and the space that CA16 has, I don't think so. And I think a lot of it is somewhere where the higher range differences are. And I think generally there's a certain level of higher frequencies that expands the stage, and then you go too far and then it flattens the stage. So I think CA16, where it was sort of a darker set but actually still had extension, I think that worked really well. So you ended up with a higher expansive stage, but it didn't really flatten it with higher frequencies. So just a general note there. I think CA16 actually did better than both of the other two in stage and in separation and imaging. Again, you get this whole bass level here where it doesn't really bottom out to become clean mids. It just kind of clouds up, muddies up the imaging and the separation and all those things. So do take that into consideration as well. So again, that is a semi-quick take on CA16 Pro and how it kind of mixes together with its two previous brothers, CA16 and ZAS. So thank you guys again for tuning in, and I will see you next time.